Because in a moment I'm joined now by Richard Haass, former American diplomat. He's been someone who's been a leading figure on various diplomatic issues across the world. I appreciate you joining us, Mr. Haass. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. You've been a former President Emeritus, also on the Council on Foreign Relations. Just want to understand from you, first, let's talk about the importance of this meeting between the two principals. Prime Minister Modi among the first leaders to meet President Trump since he took over. I think he's the fourth leader. What's your sense? Is India priority for this administration, or is Trump simply trying to strike deals with various countries at the moment, India being one of them?
Maybe neither, in answer to your questions. India is obviously important. The president and the prime minister had a good relationship the first time around. But when you look at the world, the United States is obviously concerned about what's going on in Europe, the Middle East, the Asia Pacific. I think India is important, but it's mainly seen by this administration through an economic lens, priority being to reduce the trade imbalance that is significantly in India's favor.
So what would that mean? We've already heard a very cryptic post from the US president suggesting reciprocal tariffs. Is that, you believe, an idea that is central to the Trump government's policy of making America great again, and irrespective of which country they're dealing with, reciprocal tariffs is something India and other countries will have to now live with?
The short answer is yes. India is not being singled out. It's not being penalized. We're seeing tariffs used for various reasons. We saw it against Canada and Mexico in order to get changes in their policy at the border. We've seen it in terms of aluminum and steel imports in order to protect American industries. And now there's talk of imposing so-called reciprocal tariffs to bring American tariffs up to the levels which other countries tariff American exports. I think that there is an opportunity here, though, for India. For the United States to raise tariffs to India's levels is not good for either country. A much wiser path would ultimately be for India and the United States to reduce tariffs in a parallel way. And I would hope that would ultimately be on the agenda and where the U.S.-Indian economic relationships, so rather than having a race, if you will, to the top in tariffs, let's have a race to reduce them.
You're saying a race to reduce tariffs could well be on the anvil, but Mr. Haass, Donald Trump has also pushed for reducing U.S. reliance in a way on Chinese manufacturing, trying to curb Chinese economic dominance. Could this move to sort of send out signals to China benefit India in some way, or do you believe it will come with conditions? How should we see how America approaches Beijing?
That's a different issue. I think what's going on with China, in some cases, it's technology. The United States does not want certain technologies, advanced technologies, to reach China. Also, though, there's real concerns when it comes to China that they subsidize all sorts of state-owned enterprises. They subsidize exports. So essentially, China is an unfair economic competitor. I see that as a slightly different situation. India is obviously strategically somewhat or potentially important vis-a-vis China. A more immediate issue, by the way, we haven't mentioned it, is Indian purchases of Russian energy and Russian oil. And that has been a concern of the United States, and that might factor as we get farther into negotiations over Russia and Ukraine, because that's a potential source of leverage.
It's interesting you just spoke about Russia and Ukraine at the moment. The president has had several phone calls in quick succession, we are told, with Russian President Vladimir Putin and with the Ukrainian President Zelensky. Are you seeing that to be the priority at the moment of the Trump administration when it looks at the world at the moment? Let's end the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, then we'll deal with the rest of the world, Gaza and Ukraine?
I think that's fair enough. When it comes to the world, those are probably the two immediate priorities, Ukraine and Gaza. I think the bigger priorities, though, are domestic. All the things that are going on here in terms of executive actions, to reduce spending in certain areas, to reverse some policies that were inherited, to increase the authority and power of the president. So I think there's a domestic focus right now, but I don't take issue with your point that the two pressing international issues, most pressing, are probably in Europe, given the war with Ukraine, and in the Middle East. And the Middle East could be two things. It could be diplomatic possibilities with Iran, as well as the entire question of Gaza.
What do you think is the best case scenario for India from an Indian perspective from a Trump administration? We have the US-India Defense Cooperation Act in place. Could there be transfers of technology? Do you believe that it's a give and take with the Trump administration, quid pro quo? You accept what we say on tariffs and we'll give you benefits on defense technology transfers, for example.
Well, Mr. Trump's history and his pattern is to be transactional, to basically have quid pro quos, gives and takes. But I could, again, I think the most pressing bilateral issue between us is to reduce the trade imbalance, to get India to reduce some of its tariffs. And again, I would think there's an opportunity ultimately to avoid American tariff raising and to get India to lower its tariffs. I would think that would be the best thing economically for the relationship. If we can also begin to, or continue rather, to broaden the strategic relationship, that would be well and good. And by the way, there's a lot of bipartisan momentum there. This does not need to be invented. The U.S.-Indian relationship, as you know, has come a long way in recent decades. And I don't see anyone arguing that should stop. The real question is how far and how deep it can go, and that's really up to both countries.
But am I right in saying that you believe that the Trump administration would rather prioritize, therefore, a stronger economic partnership, which is a win-win for both, rather than, as some previous governments in recent times have done, to strengthen Quad, focus on regional strategic partnerships? Do you believe that's not top of the mind of this administration? This administration, at least for now, is singularly focused on promoting American economic interests. And therefore, India has to learn to deal with a very different kind of American administration.
Look, the two need not be mutually exclusive. One can promote security or strategic interests as well as the economic. But I think all things being equal, you're essentially right. That this administration's international priority is more on economic issues, hence the emphasis on tariffs. Also, the United States and India do not have, at the moment, a big diplomatic issue dividing them. We don't have the equivalent of what the United States and Russia have over Ukraine, or what the United States has with several countries over, say, Gaza, or with Iran over nuclear weapons, or with China over Taiwan. So I think for the United States and India, probably the central feature of the relationships are more related to things economic than things strategic.
One of the concerns, of course, Mr. Haass, that India has is that H-1B visas, critical for expanding our IT force. Donald Trump's administration has sent mixed signals on the issue of expanding H-1B visas. Is that the kind of issue that you believe India can take up with the Trump administration, or is this an administration very clear because of its sort of Make America Great Again credo, it will be reluctant to expand H-1B visas to Indian IT force workers?
Well, from all reports, the administration is divided on that. I think there's a consensus in the administration to be tough on border enforcement, particularly on the southern border. But questions of legal immigration and the potential to expand H-1B visas probably divides this administration. There's those from the technology sphere who are all in favor of it, others who simply tend to oppose immigration no matter what. So that seems to me an issue that, how can I put it, that can play out in different ways. And I think it's in the interest of both countries. I happen to be in favor of increased numbers of H-1B visas. I think it's good for us. I think it's good for India and others. So I would hope there could be a meeting of the minds there. And I don't. My own view is the administration is not close to that.
Let me ask you, therefore, in conclusion, if you were to give any advice to Prime Minister Modi, in his first term, he came to America and said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." We want a Trump government. And this was 1 year before the US presidential elections. Guess what? Joe Biden becomes president. There was some concern over going over the top, if I may use the word, in sort of embracing Donald Trump. Now, what would your advice be? How should the Indian Prime Minister be dealing with this Trump 2.0?
I've known the Prime Minister of India for over a decade now. And one of the many things I've learned is I would not presume to give him advice. He's got a good relationship with the president. This relationship has evolved significantly under presidents of both parties in recent years. I would hope the two countries could expand their strategic cooperation, and I would hope they could reduce some of the economic frictions between them. And as we just discussed, I would like to see an expansion of the H-1B issue. So I think there continues to be lots of upside to the U.S.-Indian relationship, and it's one of the rare areas. One of the good things, it's a rare area of bipartisan support in this country, where Democrats and Republicans alike favor a more robust, more important U.S.-Indian relationship. So Prime Minister comes here pushing on an open door.
You know, the reason I asked you that last question, Mr. Haass, was I thought as someone who knows both the principles, what is the way to Donald Trump's heart? I think the world is still guessing what's the way to Donald Trump's heart. How does someone like Mr. Modi, who otherwise, you know, has shown himself to build personal chemistry as an element of diplomacy, what's the best way to Donald Trump's heart at the moment?
Well, again,
give him a Harley Davidson?
I'll leave that one to you. Look, this prime minister has forged a good relationship with this president, and it's not obvious to me he needs the advice from me or any other American. And again, he's arriving here where there's mainly one set of frictions over the trade imbalance, over Indian tariffs. So I think India is going to ultimately have to make some big decisions about opening up its economy. Those are India's decisions to make. Those are sovereign decisions. I think in the long run, it would be good for India as well as good for American exporters, as well as for our bilateral relationship. But that's up to the Indian leadership to decide. And as I said before, I think both countries would benefit rather than from reciprocally raising tariffs to in parallel lowering tariffs.
Richard Haass, for giving us your perspective from your vantage point. I appreciate you joining me here on India Today. Thank you very much. Richard Haass, one of America's leading diplomats, joining us there from New York.